Hey, so I know it's been a while since my last video. Since last year, I flew to England, I had some tea with some fascinating strangers, I sat by lots of fires and read lots of books, and I met my girlfriend Debbie from Czech Republic, who was a filmmaker just like me. We went on lots of walks to pubs together. To get straight to the point, one of the best things that Debbie and I have watched together on lockdown has been this little Netflix show you might have heard of called The Queen's Gambit. We both thought it was really good, and maybe you did too. So that's why we're here, talking about it today.
That's right. So welcome to The Queen's Gambit is based on a 1983 book by Walter Tevis, and it was adapted by Scott Frank. There have been many attempts to produce a Hollywood movie based on the book, but after Houston and I read it, we both realized that there is no way to tell this story in 2 hours.
The Queen's Gambit released only a little over a month ago, and it's already become one of Netflix's most successful shows to date. Let's see, searches for chess sets are up 250% on eBay. Google searches for how to play chess have hit an all-time high in 9 years, and the original book is now on the New York Times bestseller list 37 years after its release. The limited series idea has been used plenty of times to adapt novels in the last several decades, from Pride and Prejudice to Narnia and Little Women, but most people still think movies are the only option. If anything, I think this show should serve as solid proof that the miniseries is the best format for adapting long-form fiction and maintaining the pace and flow of the source material. And it really makes me want to see more miniseries adaptations of stuff like Harry Potter and The Great Gatsby and To Kill a Mockingbird.
There's just so much more room to breathe and witness the evolution of a character, from a plucky kid to a confident world champion, with 7 hours on the clock. And there's also more room for intimate details and direct adaptation. It was only after Houston and I went and read The Queen's Gambit that we were amazed by the way Scott Frank was able to adapt the material so faithfully. The dialogue in the book and the show are word for word almost exactly the same. Frank even devises ways to include the third-person narration from the book in other formats.
Yeah, and where a lesser writer might have just invented a narrator for the show or had Beth narrate it in the past tense, Scott Frank doesn't fall for that gimmick. Instead, he gives some of the narration text from the book to different characters, like the sports commentators during the matches.
So I think she should accept the draw.
She should accept the draw.
The world will see it as a solid achievement.
People would call it a solid achievement.
A draw, however, is not a win.
A draw, however, was not a win.
The one thing we know about Elizabeth Harmon is that she loves to win.
And the one thing in her life she was sure she loved was a win.
They managed to convey the same information from the book word for word, but still make it feel organic to the TV series format. One of the most remarkable things about the Queen's Gambit novel is just how dense and well-researched all the explanations of the chess world proved to be. The author Walter Tevis was not particularly great at playing chess, but he did spend several years reporting on it in the 1970s and got really familiar with all the idiosyncrasies of that subculture. As such, the novel does a really good job of explaining the world of chess in accessible terms for people who don't understand it, but it also nails some of the more complex details for the ones who do. And I think the show nails this too.
And that's what leads us to the second part of our discussion.
In the past few weeks, I've read a lot of reviews from professional chess players who have said that this is one of the most authentic portrayals of the chess world ever put to screen, spare for, the occasional Hollywood flourish. One of the biggest feats of this show is the way it takes something as slow and cerebral as chess and makes it into a thrilling spectacle on par with the likes of The Karate Kid and Rocky. To be sure, the novel itself does a wonderful job of making the chess matches engaging from the start, but transferring that to the screen is another thing entirely, and that's where the direction and the editing come in.
Scott Frank, the director, is known for writing Western-themed stories like Logan or Godless. It makes sense then that many of his chess matches actually feel more like cowboy standoffs, just without the pistols.
Beth Harmon.
Shit.
The conflict is always in the character. The pieces on the board are just an extension of those characters. Whether they're attacking or retreating or staring each other down in anticipation. Every big chess match serves as an evolution of Beth and who she is becoming.
The editing and direction in The Queen's Gambit are so freaking exquisite, and that goes beyond just the chess. I do think we should talk about some of these chess matches though, because it would have been very easy to get bored of the same game being played over and over again in the same way, but it's chiefly thanks to the editing and the direction that we never do get bored. Some of this comes from the way that each match is written and the distinct motivations that go into every game, but I also think a good portion of the variety comes from the fact that each match is presented differently, even just visually, than all the ones before it. Some matches use various types of time lapses to speed through the moves. Some are folded into energetic montages. Some matches use commentators to narrate the choices being made. Others use Beth's narration telling her mother about how she felt about her choices after the fact. And then some other matches are entirely wordless, relying on the Kuleshov effect and extreme close-ups to give meaning.
Sometimes we are so certain about the game's outcome that we even don't need to see the game. Instead, the editor trims the axes from the first move
Well, I never thought you'd let me trade queens.
to the drinks afterwards. We've seen all we needed to see. There are so many hard cuts that eliminate the axes and show us instead of telling us. Like this one.
But I am convinced that relaxation can only improve them.
Or this one.
Do you still like my hair?
Another one of the things that I loved about the editing of this show is that it always feels like there's more than one thing being conveyed at once. There are lots of sequences here, extended periods when we see many layers of information in a short span of time. Some of them are standard montages with music, but others just intercut two seemingly unrelated things happening at once, like this scene. On the one hand, Beth is on the phone with the government trying to secure funds to go to Russia, and on the other, we're simultaneously intercutting her playing racquetball with Jolene. When the funds don't come through on the phone, we finally cut to Jolene and Beth finished with their game, where Jolene tells Beth that she'll give her the money she needs instead. It might seem simple, and maybe it is, but this is so much more engaging than showing those two scenes one after the other. We're not multitasking, we're just adding more layers and keeping it so that the energy never dies. I was thinking about this, and I think this actually might be one of the areas where the show has a distinct advantage over the book, because while the book has to sit through every single chess match and describe them all in detail, the show is able to sort of intercut other plot beats throughout the chess games and create more layers of meaning to keep the viewer engaged. Because of that, the scene-to-scene momentum never really loses its way, and everything always carries multiple layers of meaning. So, speaking of layers of meaning, though, let's get to the real meat of this video. Our discussion of Beth Harmon's character. There are many unconventional things about Beth as a protagonist, and I think many of the traits that make her different are the ones that I found relatable. She's an introvert, for one thing, and someone far more comfortable in her head than in a group of people. Beth begins her journey as a very cold and dejected child. It's a storytelling feat that the writers managed to endear us to her and make us root for her, even though she's not the traditional warm and fuzzy protagonist, nor is she particularly full of quips or jokes. In fact, she's often quite self-serious and guarded and internal.
On the Enneagram personality test, we think that Beth is a 5, the investigator. The 5s are driven by the desire for capability and believe that knowledge is power. 5s are gifted thinkers and talented self-learners. In most of life, they try to draw everything they experience into a system that they can dominate. And often, that system helps them to make sense of everything else. For Beth, mastering every aspect of her life is what drives her forward at any given moment. Especially as an orphan, she grew up with little control over anything in her life. Mastering each part of her existence for her feels like liberation. First, she masters chess against Mr. Scheibel. Then she masters chess against school students. Eventually, she also learns to master her wardrobe and makeup choices. And by the end, she's mastered her addictions too. The biggest fear of a 5 is becoming useless, helpless, or incapable. Beth, as a result, is often driven by a desire to remain capable and independent all on her own, without the help of friends or allies or mentors. And for much of the show, she is very capable, especially on the chessboard.
Beth is such a confident and capable character that I think in the hands of a weaker writer, she would have been really boring to watch because she initially just mops the floor with everyone she meets. I think one of the biggest feats of the writing in the show is that Beth is a protagonist who is confident and capable and independent and full of talent, and yet she still somehow feels like an underdog most of the time. I think part of this has got to come from the fact that Beth is always framed as a foreigner within the world of chess in any room that she enters, despite her God-given talent. When the show begins, Beth's sheltered childhood growing up in an orphanage makes the world around her feel so much bigger than her, full of questions and roadblocks. Beth does not have much real knowledge about the world of chess at the start. All she's been able to gather has been from one book and a janitor, and at first it seems insurmountable that she could ever become something like a grandmaster. Early on, she doesn't even know what a grandmaster is. I really felt like there was something relatable about Beth entering this bigger, wider world of chess and suddenly realizing there are people there who are just as talented as her, if not more. I think the thing that I related to is that it's like being that one film kid in your own town or your own school who's really good at making movies, and then you go to film school and you realize, oh, there are other people who do this too, and maybe they're better than me. Of course, and maybe this is obvious, the fact that Beth is new to the world of chess proves to be useful to the viewer of the show too. The majority of people watching are just as unfamiliar with the idiosyncrasies of the subculture as she is. It helps that we're learning as she does. The relative scale of the Queen's Gambit seems to grow with every episode, and as it does, the toughest opponents for Beth at the start of the story wind up feeling like small potatoes by the time she's going to Moscow to face Borgov. I just think there's something really satisfying about that evolution in the look how far we've come kind of sense.
Another element in Beth's evolution is the way that her wardrobe and colors grow and develop around her. You can tell that the costume designer, Gabrielle Binder, was precisely mirroring what was happening inside of Beth throughout the show. For the 50s, Binder was inspired by Jean Seberg, because she was also an outsider like Beth. In the 60s, with Beth in New York, Binder had the film star Eddie Sedgwick on his mind. More than anything, though, Binder was influenced by the widely popular Biba style. Speaking of colors,
the color blue in movies often has a lot to do with freedom and inner peace, but in The Queen's Gambit, it's more associated with a sort of melancholic, uniquely female loneliness. As a child, Beth is bathed in blue whenever she lays in bed staring at the ceiling and using her gift, and this carries on into her teenage years when her chess offers a retreat from the rest of the world. When we first meet Alma Wheatley, she's depressed and lonely because she's lost a child and has an absent husband, and Alma lives in a blue house surrounded by blue wallpaper and covered in blue clothing. Soon after her adoption, as Beth ventures alone into the world of chess, she mostly imitates Alma's blue clothing choices. But as Beth grows in her chess abilities and both she and Alma become less lonely, the blue fades out of both of their palettes. Alma moves out of her depression and more into warm pink colors as she thrives. Beth grows into some red, and as she takes off in her chess career, she frequently wears white, black, and square patterns like a chessboard.
of course, green is a vital part of Beth's character too. We first meet the color green when Beth is placed in the orphanage. For most of the first episode, she wears pale green, symbolizing the start of her addiction. But the head of the orphanage, Mrs. Deardorff, wears all green too. Green pops up throughout the story most often when Beth is experiencing loss or heartbreak and doubling down on her addiction. It comes to a head during her trip to Paris, after Alma's death, when she begins to drown in green. In Paris, Beth is the most isolated she's ever been, and she's also clothed in green more than she's ever been. After waking up in a bathtub, the place where the great Paul Morphy died at 47, she drugs herself up and fails her match with Barkov. All the while, she's wearing a dress that looks just like the pills she cannot let go. Green continues to appear as Beth spirals. When Harry finally confronts her after she isolates herself in drugs and alcohol, she wears a green beanie, almost like her head is occupied with nothing but poisonous distortion. In the last episode, Beth finally faces her childhood trauma and remembers the giant green truck that caused her mother's death. Then she goes and flashes the green pills. And in the final match against Borgov, she returns to her roots and wears a dress the same shade as the one her birth mother stitched her as a child. It was the one that Mrs. Deardorff burned. She wears Alma's shade of lipstick too, symbols of both of her mothers, reminding her that she is fully content with her past and herself.
Beth eventually masters chess and fashion and addiction, but the one thing she can't seem to master is relationships with other people. Especially around men, Beth guards her emotions the same way she guards pieces on a chessboard, and it makes sense. Throughout her childhood, she's had not one but two absent and borderline abusive fathers, and mother relationships have been complicated too.
After I read John Bowlby's theory of mother's attachment, I realized that Beth probably has a chaotic attachment with her birth mother. Mothers in chaotic attachments usually have unresolved pasts, trauma, and suffer addictions or mental illnesses. One moment she's secure, content, and present. But at another moment, the heavy effect of her pain causes her to lash out. Even when Beth is an adult, she struggles in relationships and desires to escape reality, mostly because her childhood wasn't a very safe place. After first meeting Alma, it still takes her a long time to feel a sense of trust in a mother figure once again. With Alma and Mr. Wheatley, Beth re-experiences the absent father and the mother struggling with addictive substance, and even re-experiencing her mother's death. Still though, Alma's presence in her life ultimately helps Beth to grow into a more mature woman and a human being through having a close relationship with another person without transactions. At first, Alma and Beth's relationship start out as two business people making money, but after many months of traveling, Alma becomes Beth's one and only real friend. Beth was deeply formed by both of her mothers, and they built her into a person who will always struggle with intimate relationships. But even after Alma is gone, there is hope that she can find some people she deeply cares for.
Because Beth guards her emotions so heavily against lots of the people that she meets, there are multiple moments in the show where it feels like we're about to steer into some sort of toxic trope or sinister character. Whether it's Alma, who seems very money-hungry and exploitative at first, or Beltic, who comes across like a bit of a prick. Even in that first episode where Beth is going down the stairs to the basement and meeting Mr. Scheibel for the first time, I remember thinking like, she's gonna get molested, she's gonna get raped. There's no way that doesn't happen. Ultimately though, to the surprise of both Beth and the audience, almost everyone we meet proves themselves to be far more complicated and sympathetic in their vices and virtues than meets the eye. It takes Beth going back to the orphanage and seeing that Mr. Scheibel was the caring father she always had for her to realize that maybe some of the other people in her life care about her too, if she lets them in. For Enneagram 5s, the biggest fear is being helpless or incapable, and I think this is pretty evident within Beth. She refuses help from many of the people in her world because she feels that doing everything herself is what gives her value. The trope of the lonely, tortured genius has been popular for centuries, even within chess stories. The real-life chess hero Bobby Fischer was known to be reclusive and moody and independent, and there have been 2 movies exploring his tragic, lonely brilliance. But The Queen's Gambit challenges all of these narratives by showing that fulfillment does not come alone. We need connection and community and vulnerability for our victories to mean something. Our biggest cheer together watching the show was when Benny and Beltic and the twins called her on the phone to give her advice on the match. It's a cheesy, sappy, warm and fuzzy moment, sure, but it's as satisfying as ever. And so is the moment where, after all the fear-mongering about Russians, Borgov pulls her into a hug. The show nails a pretty delicate tension with Beth. On the one hand, she's a strong and independent woman who is able to beat men from around the world in chess. But on the other hand, the writers don't force her to reject her femininity or her vulnerability to succeed. By the end of the story, Beth is simultaneously strong and vulnerable, independent and feminine. There is no conflict between these qualities, and emotions are not weakness. At the beginning of the story, Beth shelters herself and hides within the squares of the chessboard. But by the end, they are her liberation and her lifeblood. Beth's arc hinges on realizing that chess does not have to be an escape from reality, but might actually be her gateway to inter-reality and community and relationship with other people who will be there for her.
I'm someone who seeks for beauty in life, so seeing Beth trying to figure out her voice and her style and her makeup throughout the show was just such a joy for me because I love clothes and I love makeup. Another thing that I could relate to, maybe even more, was her withdrawal from relationships when things get tricky and her desire to isolate herself. And I think I recently experienced that having a good community in my life has enriched me so much.
If we're talking about personal stuff, I think one of the things that I really appreciated about the show was the fact that it is about a character who is involved in a really weird subculture, and I could relate to that a lot. I've been involved in a lot of weird subcultures in my life, from Lego to film to theme parks, and another thing that I saw of myself in Beth was the idea that she's really good at this one thing, and that thing makes her different than everyone else. And so thus, she uses that one thing to view the whole world through that lens. And that can be a blessing and a curse, and I do the same thing sometimes with the things that I'm really interested in. I think one of the things that I liked about the way that the show lands is not that Beth needs to go join the real world and give up her chess obsession, but rather that she should use her chess passion as an ability to enter community with people, instead of this sort of rogue individualism that she had before. So the video is about to end. I think we should thank some of the people involved.
Thank you, Scott Frank.
Thank you, Anya Taylor-Joy.
Thank you, Marielle Heller. By the way, I loved your movie, The Diary of a Teenage Girl. It's very special for me.
And yes, even though you canceled Daredevil and Dark Crystal, thank you, Netflix. I'm gonna go inside. It is cold. All right.